and I will begin with questions. I'd like to talk about the retroactivity issue. So, Ms. Foster, because Honor first began enforcing unbundling in New Mexico, I'd like to begin my questions with you. Prior to the issuance of Honor's Dear Reporter unbundling letter in 2010, approximately what percentage of producers were deducting bundled costs?
Mr. Chairman, prior to that Dear Reporter letter, I would say that the major oil companies, the ones that have large regulatory staff and are probably more aware of royalty issues and speak to Honor more frequently, might have been deducting those costs. But it was a wholesale effort by Honor to really focus on New Mexico and go after small producers. The audits that came up were of small producers. So I don't know the exact percentage of small producers who were not unbundling. I believe it was probably a very, very small number.
So most were deducting bundled costs? Most of your members?
Mr. Chairman, most were deducting them 100%. The question with unbundling is whether you can no longer deduct 100% of those costs anymore that the third-party processor charges you. Now, with the unbundling scheme, you can only deduct a percentage of those costs, and the question is, where on the scale between 100 and 0% can you deduct?
Okay. Let me continue. And prior to the unbundling letter, did any of the producers have any reason to believe that deduction of these bundled costs was somehow impermissible?
Mr. Chairman, I believe not, no.
Okay. And had any producers that were deducting the bundling cost been audited by Honor prior to 2010 and found to be out of compliance?
Mr. Chairman, if they were audited prior to 2010 and found out of compliance, it was not specifically for the unbundling issue.
Okay.
We were not aware that unbundling was really an issue until 2010.
All right. So, in fact, this letter from DJ Simmons, a small producer in New Mexico, clearly states that they had been audited many times, but not once were they told that the deduction of bundled expenses was incorrect. So, prior to 2010, it's like we just discussed. No one would have thought that they would be out of compliance. Now, Ms. Foster, up to how many years in the past has Honor retroactively applied its interpretation?
Mr. Chairman, at this point, the regulations are that Honor can go back and require companies to reverse and rebook 7 years worth of reporting, and that reporting is monthly.
So that'd go back to 2008.
At this point, yes. 2808, fortunately, will drop off the books soon.
Now, Ms. Madlock, have you personally helped clients unbundled years prior to 2010?
No, I would have to agree with Ms. Foster that the small and medium-sized companies that I represent were not being required to unbundle, were unaware of unbundling.
But if people have to go back in time and retroactively calculate this, is there going to be significant expense involved?
There is very significant expense. If you're going to a plant that the agency's unbundled, you have the expense of the bookkeeping work required to reverse 84 months of reporting and then rebook it at a different number, and there's additional royalties owed. If you're going to a plant that's not been unbundled, you first have to try to figure out how to unbundle it, or you have to give up 100% of your deductions going back 7 years.
Now, Director Gould, because we've been discussing the reinterpretation in 2010, I'm concerned that all of the states producing oil and gas, especially western states, including Colorado, are going to have a real difficult time applying this retroactively. What's your position on pausing and re-examining the retroactive application of unbundling on natural gas producers? And will you also work with industry to find a workable solution and other stakeholders that provides more certainty to lessees?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the questions. In terms of a pause, the requirements have always been in place. It's not anything new that Honor has been doing. We didn't actually call it unbundling prior to that point. And in fact, the New Mexico auditors came to Honor back then and asked us to assist them with this in seeing that companies were deducting 100% of their transportation and processing allowances, when in fact they knew there was processing and transportation within that was not within the regulations or the law. So in terms of a pause, we need to continue to make sure that companies are deducting what is allowable and then not deducting what's not allowable. It's not something we can just take a pause on. In terms of retroactive, if companies have not been paying correctly, the law provides that on federal land we can go back to 7 years, and on Indian land there is no requirement for us to hold at 7 years. So again, I think the most important point here is that there has been no change to the requirements. New Mexico auditors themselves brought this to Honor's attention, and if companies are paying all that they are required to pay, there's no need to go back and make any corrections to the reporting.
Well, and if the committee will indulge me, what about the complexity? When you're a small producer as opposed to a major, where to put that on the timeline of production seems like a really difficult thing. Don't you think you need to go back to the drawing board at all and relook at this rule?
We are very willing, and we have already started a lot of discussions with industry. A few weeks ago, actually last month, API and Copus accountants came into Denver, and I met with them to have a long discussion about how best to work through these issues to better understand what is and what is not allowable under the regulations. So we're very open to that. And keep in mind, too, that we will entertain any reasonable request. So if a company comes in, any company comes in and gives us a reasonable reasonable methodology, then we will look at that methodology, and if it's reasonable, we'll accept that as a way to unbundle.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes